constraint, you have to place it somewhere. You have to place it within the enterprise. What Marshall does is places it within the context of the entrepreneur. That is, the entrepreneur's capabilities to increasingly engage in investment, expanding production, all of what it takes, lowering costs, and continually doing this. This kind of capability of the entrepreneur declines over time. It's an inherent constraint within the entrepreneur. And it's not within the individual entrepreneur. Marshall places it in the context of basically, let's say, kind of a family enterprise. So the ownership of the entrepreneur will change over time from generation to generation. And what he would call 3 generations clogs. The clogs are 3 generations, clogs being wooden shoes that workers use more. It would decline. So you have initially hot shot out there doing all kind of work, making the firm grow. Then the next generation comes along, they still have enough gumption. 3rd generation, a bunch of lazy bastards, and they screw up the firm, and it declines. Now, why is this important? Because if you're going to prevent the enterprise from having an ongoing effort to continually reduce its costs, beat out its competitors, and there's no constraint inside the enterprise, then what makes the enterprise stop from monopolizing the market? Well, there's nothing. So you have to place something internal to the enterprise. Now, we have some of this kind of stuff being placed inside the enterprise in order to constrain its size. One of them would be law of diminishing returns. Within the mainstream stuff that we'll get to, this becomes an important feature within the short period. In the long period, you have issues about returns to scale. And we have in current theory now, an issue about decreasing returns to scale. Somehow, decreasing returns to scale will exhibit itself, and presto, you'll have a constraint to the size of the enterprise under competitive conditions. But that's just simply, in a sense, imposed. You have to constrain the size of the enterprise. How do you do it? You simply assume that somehow there's a constraint on the size of the enterprise that's internal to the enterprise. So Marshall, now in terms of the entrepreneur. What this does is gives him a way to characterize the market in the following manner. You have a range of enterprises of different sizes or different cost levels. This is average total cost for every one of them. You can draw your marginal cost curves, etc. Or actually, we should talk about expenses of production, average expenses of production. And what Marshall says is that we have an industry, and we're going to define or specify or constrain this industry to that its growth rate is 0. So you have a particular amount of production for the industry as a whole. It's stable, and you have different sized enterprises within the industry representing the different entrepreneurial capabilities of the enterprise. So the industry consists of a whole bunch of different size, cost enterprises. Now, this particular image of an industry like this, and this is a very, in a sense, powerful image, because if you were solely schooled in mainstream theory today, all enterprises are more or less the same in long period equilibrium. Here we have a framework in which enterprises will not be the same even in the long period. They'll be a different size cost framework. The way he describes this It's as follows, and it's important to note that the kind of analogy or imagery that he uses, because it's often typical of economists in general, not just classical economists. Okay, what he introduces is the life cycle of the enterprise. Now, the life cycle of the enterprise is actually a very powerful notion that, in some sense, was lost after Marshall until it got picked up by evolutionary economists somewhere in the 60s and 70s, and then re-articulated. But he does it in terms of trees in the forest parable. Anybody heard of trees in the forest parable? That's because you read everything, Matthew. You ignore Matthew. Anybody have heard of trees in the forest parable? It's a well-known one coming out of Marshall for those who are engaged in this kind of historical understanding of the theory. Once you get into it, controversies in the 1920s and 30s, you will see references to it all the time. And it's very interesting. It reads as follows. But here we may read a lesson from the young trees of the forest as they struggle upwards through the benumbing shade of their older rivals. Many succumb on the way, and a few only survive. Those few become stronger with every year, and they get larger. They get a larger share of the light and air with every increase of their height. And at last, in their turn, they tower above their neighbors, and seems as though they would grow on forever, and forever become stronger as they grow. That's this notion that if you have increasing returns, capabilities, you will continually grow stronger and taller, etc. But they do not. Something internal to these trees, so to speak. One tree will last longer and full vigor and attain a greater size than another, but sooner or later age tells on them. What's the importance about age? What?
They start to decay as they get older.
Okay, yeah, but what's important about it?
Then they can't get too big.
No. That's all true, but what's important about it?
In terms of the industry or the tree?
What?
Minus product zero.
No. That's inherent in the tree itself. The tree cannot escape from being old. Remember, you have to have a constraint inside the enterprise. The constraint here is that you get old. You can't avoid that. If you could avoid getting old, then you'd be like, who's that person who had a nice painting made of him? Dorian Gray. You could be Dorian Gray. I mean, that's the point. That's the kind of metaphor analogy that he's using is a way to insert something that constrains the enterprise or the trees in this particular case. Okay. Though the taller ones have better access to light and air than their rivals, they gradually lose vitality, and one after another they give places to others, which, though of less material strength, have on their side the vigor of youth. And as with the growth of trees, so it is with the growth of businesses. As a general rule, we'll just stop there for a second. So, as trees grow up and down in a forest, the forest itself remains constant. The individual trees grow up and down. So, as in industry, the industry has a constant amount of output. The various enterprises will grow and decline and not change that amount of output. So the forest remains constant while the individual entities in it grow and decline. Now, a couple things here. First of all, he uses a biological metaphor analogy. And why should anything such as trees growing and dying in a forest have any reference to how enterprises work? But virtually every economist believes in biological and natural analogies. They do not use social analogies. It's always non-social, asocial one. This is both whether mainstream or heterodox. And why don't they use social ones? because social ones can never do what they want to have done. They want to describe a social world by the use of a non-social world. This is misplaced theorizing. But of course, you've all been trained to believe and accept it, so nobody would ever question it. That's the first thing. They use this. The second one is what happens if you actually include something social. An example that Marshall brings up is that, and as with the growth of trees, so it was with the growth of businesses. And as a general rule, before the great development of the vast joint stock companies, which often stagnate but do not readily die. Joint stock companies, basically modern corporation. Joint stock is the British term for them, the corporate form in the U.S. What's so important about this? What's so important about the corporate form in the U.S. or joint stock companies? Not true, but not relevant here.
It's a social organization.
Divorces ownership and control.
You're getting a little bit closer, but not. Is that management who manage the enterprises are separate from the enterprise itself. So enterprises are people, but management is themselves. And they can replace, the management can replace itself. So you hire in people to take over the enterprise. And so the enterprise's vigor does not decline as if age was involved. So they escape the problem of age. Remember, Marshall's story is this family enterprise. Socially, hot shots, ordinary person, then debauchery eliminates the enterprise. I mean, that's a story. So it's a cultural story about how families grow and decline in terms of the enterprise. That doesn't occur when joint stock companies own a modern corporation. So in this case, then it doesn't occur, then in fact, this parable of forest and the trees actually has no bearing anymore. So why shouldn't a corporation always remain vigorous and run everybody out of the market? Marshall wasn't willing to contemplate that particular story. That would clearly be a non-competitive framework. But this is an example of introducing social into your story. It creates problems. People just don't do it. So, we'll ignore all the thing about the joint stock company because it creates too many problems. In fact, joint stock companies as a particular entity and economic theorizing of the business enterprise from Marshall, more or less, to the 1970s or 80s was not dealt with by mainstream theory. They want to deal with it as a special case off to the side in an industrial organization. Never formed the core of their theory. They've changed their tune a little bit. They just simply say that joint stock companies or modern corporations behave just like competitive enterprise. That's contestability theory that came up in the 80s. Or they just simply assume that they're all competitive in any case. So they just ignore the whole thing about it. But in fact, for 60 years or so, it was simply ignored within mainstream theory because it creates real fundamental problems. Now, but we have other problems here. We have all these damn differentiated firms, enterprises out here. How are we going to come up with a theory of prices where we have a single price determined in the market? Got a whole bunch of different size, cost enterprises. Which one's going to be the basis for setting the price? Average, wrong. Not the average. Average, you take the various sizes and divide by n. Right? That would be the average. Now, this is both, a solution to it is both theoretically quite interesting, but also problematic. what he does, what Marshall does, is to overcome this problem of differentiated sizes, cost of various enterprises, to come up with a way to talk about the market price vis-a-vis the enterprise, is to introduce a thing called the representative enterprise. Actually, we call it the representative firm. This representative firm is a mechanism to eliminate the problems of differentiation among business enterprises within the market and be able to form a theory of prices based on a representative firm. The representative firm is to get rid of all the differentiation. That is to get rid of heterogeneity within the market. Sounds like what? Representative consumer that Marshall had, not to mention the representative agent today. This is simply another example where heterogeneity is incompatible with mainstream theorizing. I can see how it can be, but one would have never thought that as they started this stuff, that heterogeneity is in fact a problem. So when people talk about, oh, I don't like representative agents, they talk about it all the time today. They say, let's go back to Marshall. Marshall's predicated on representative agents. It indicates that people who say this actually don't know a damn thing about Marshall. Okay, so Marshall introduces the notion of the representative firm. Now, you have to be very clear about what he does here. He makes the firm a core entity, a theoretical concept for economic theorizing. First time it's done in economics at all. We have to now, from now on, consider the business enterprise when we talk about theory of prices or anything else that goes on at the micro level in markets. Prior to that, the discussion of enterprises was not central. You might discuss it in monopoly or duopoly cases, but it wasn't central to the core framework of theorizing about prices. Marshall does this. This by itself would be sufficient in the contemporary world for a Swedish bank prize. If you want to have something that has had such an impact upon theorizing that has remained in place for 100 years, Marshall's notion of putting the firm as the core entity to theorizing about prices is there. And you don't see the business enterprise of any substantive sense in Marx. Nothing. Nor in with Marxian theory, the only time you actually start getting it with Hilferding in 1900 in Finance Capital, where they have to actually start talking about large business enterprises as having an impact upon Marxian theory. But it still doesn't really form part of Marxian theory until more of the present day. But it still seems to be more of off to the side than a core feature. And of course, all you macro people out there don't have any firms in your framework whatsoever. So somehow things get done, but no enterprises actually do them. But we'll come back to that issue later on. Trouble when you have a class with a micro person. Okay, so what's this representative enterprise? It's not an average enterprise. That's the whole point. It's representative. And that makes a big difference. There's a whole set of discussion about this over time. But we can say that it's the cost of the representative firm for a given level of aggregate production in the market that is relevant for analyzing short and long period prices, or theory of prices. So how do you want to define this sucker? When we come to discuss the causes which govern the supply price of a commodity, we shall have to analyze carefully the normal cost of producing a commodity relative to a given aggregate volume of production. And for this purpose, we have to study the expenses of the representative producer for that aggregate production, that is the representative firm. representative enterprise. Okay. Marshall describes the representative firm as one which has a fairly long life, fair success, which is managed with normal ability and which has normal access to economies, external and internal, and which belong to that aggregate volume of production. So it's not an average, it's a representative.
With average characteristics.
No, not average characteristics.
Normal.
Normal. I mean, it's a difference. Average, you simply take all the enterprises and divide by the number of enterprises. That's not representative. Now, very often people float it over between representative and average. In fact, if you were talking about it being average, it would be the same as most economists in 1900, 1910, 1920s. Certainly graduates, undergraduates who would study Marshall. And even into the 1930s, talk about an average. But it's not an average representative. Remember, it has the representative characteristics. No one enterprise actually will have all those characteristics. So it represents the enterprises in the market as opposed to being an average. Now, the introduction of this representative firm to develop a theory of prices, Marshall then had, before he actually deals with theory of prices, has to define some concepts. Has to define market, free competition, and equilibrium. Note that these are the same things which are done virtually in all textbooks. Marshall does it in his. These have to be you have to define these terms to give you an idea of what you want to be talking about. Now, a market is a place where homogeneous goods are exchanged at a point in time, economic time, which means you have short period markets and long period markets. What happens in short period markets is not the same what happens in long period markets, so you have to keep your markets separated from short period and long period. Of course, this also means that in defining the market the way he does so, he implies that market being defined with respect to time and place, you can actually clear that market. So embedded in this is a notion of market clearing, although he doesn't talk about it the way that we would talk about it most explicitly today. Because when we talk about a market, we say that the prices must be set in the market which engage in market clearing. We make it very upfront. It's not as upfront in Marshall, although it's certainly implied in it. It also means that when we talk about supply and demand curves, etc., they have to be of the same time dimension. You can't have long period cost curves showed up in the short period, nor can you have short period demand curves show up in the long period. Okay. Fast forward to conventional economic theorizing. We have short period and long period, right? We talk about short period supply curve, short period cost, long period supply curve, long period cost. Do we make any differentiation on demand side? None whatsoever. One would imply that this is basically confusion, incoherent theorizing. How can you have a short period supply curve associated with a demand curve which has no time dimension? So it can be short period or long period. Doesn't get resolved, but that's what we have out there. But it means that you can't, in particularly, talk about something which is short period to take place in the long period, or have something in the long period take place in the short period. If you do have something, say, which is in the long period that acts in the short period, we are on the verge of collapsing the nature of these analytical time periods. This actually comes up, and we'll talk about it towards the end of the course, and the articulation of what is called the kink demand curve in the 1930s, where you have long period stuff impinging upon the short period. But at the moment, they have to be analytically separate. Okay, that's the market. Free competition, not perfect competition. If I ask you about market by Marshall's free competition, you give me something about perfect competition, I will fail you. I can't be any clearer than that. They are different. Unfortunately, most people have no clue about that. Even people actually want to be specialized in the area. Free competition is different from perfect competition. Of course, in the free, there are a number of similarities, but it's not the same thing. You have freedom of entry and exit, or what you would call unimpeded entry and exit. There's no collusion among buyers and sellers. Everyone acts for themselves and have a sufficient knowledge to be able to ensure that they have the same prices either as inputs or outputs as their competitors. But it also includes, under in Marshall, buying and selling relationships between firms in the market and in the economy as a whole. That is, you can establish goodwill relationships between buyers and sellers, as long as it doesn't impede that the notion that they can set higher prices than their competitors in this particular regard. Now, why is this a particularly curious notion? When we deal with perfect competition, which we'll eventually get to and define perfect competition all over again, but when we define perfect competition, what do we say about buyers and sellers under perfect competition?
Buyers or price.
Well, they're price takers, but can we go further in this?
Don't care who they buy from.
Okay, they don't care who they buy from or who they sell to. So the buyers and sellers form a random relationship because they're indifferent on who they buy and sell with. What Marshall argued is that, first of all, that doesn't even work in commodity markets or stock markets. You actually do care who you buy and sell from, where people might think that it might not be the case. But certainly for the kind of representative firm who's not a big monopolist, remember it's still a competitive framework, they actually care who their buyers and sellers are. Who they buy and sell from. They like to attract buyers. They attract them in a way that generates what is called goodwill. And these buyers will come back to them time again as long as that prices are just like the prices of any other competitors. So how many people have a favorite pizza parlor they go to? Yeah. And you'll continue to go to it as long as you don't feel like you're being shipped by higher prices. So the prices have to remain relatively the same across the various kinds of pizza parlors, and you continue to go to one. That would be like Marshall's notion of a particular goodwill relationship between buyers and sellers. Now, what does this do? Well, in a perfectly competitive framework, when buyers and sellers are relevant to each other, we have basically this single market that is where buyers and sellers form a random relationship. Under Marshall's world, the market is, in a sense, divided up based on goodwill, as long as the prices are comparable to the other competitors. So there's not a random relationship. There is a divided up market. And this divided up market for Marshall, cannot give any advantage to the enterprises involved in it. What does this remind you of?
What was the last thing that you said before that?
What does this remind you of? If you have a market that's broken up, what does that remind you of? What?
Like, broken up in what way?
Well, we have buyers and sellers which have aligned themselves in a particular way.
Oh,
What?
yeah.
What? Well, actually imperfect competition, which oligopoly is a variant of. Yeah. So, yeah, that, of course, under imperfect competition, what does each enterprise have?
Market power.
Yeah, go on. How do you represent that market power? What? Well, that would be the kind of implied here, but how do you represent that?
Market share?
Price.
Ooh.
It's amazing you guys ever made it out of intermediate micro.
Markup pricing?
No? I mean, demand curve, downward sloping demand curve, relevant to the individual enterprise. If it's downward sloping, ergo, you will have issues of market power, prices set above marginal cost, But that's what it implies. But Marshall doesn't have that. That comes up in the late 20s and 30s to create imperfect competition. Marshall saw a divided up market, but not one that would give an enterprise its own downward sloping demand curve. And what we find in subsequent discussion is that for Marshall, enterprises do not have demand curves. We'll come back to this. The only one that has its own demand curve is a monopolist, which is considered unimportant. In fact, monopoly has always been unimportant. Who cares about monopoly? It's always considered an analytical statement which has no bearing on the core development of price theory.
I've also heard that the idea of perfect competition is just an ideal. And
Okay, well, bring that up when we do perfect competition, okay? Because we can talk about it more there. Clearly, it's implied in this notion, well, Marshall's notion of free competition, Marshall would argue it's not an ideal, it's actual fact. Now, whether it is or not is another question. But he would see, just like the representative firm is something which is, in a sense, actual. Because some would argue, some of the students would argue that Marshall would say that give me an industry, I'll give you the representative firm. For that, something which is really actual, almost actual. So he would have thought free competition is not an ideal, but an actual state of affairs. Perfect competition is where you get more of this notion of an ideal. So we can come back and talk about it there. So that's free competition. The last one is equilibrium, and equilibrium price. The issue about equilibrium here is what you've always seen. It's a mechanical form of equilibrium where you have opposing forces driving prices and quantities to a particular point in a mechanical manner. You want to use mechanics. This notion of equilibrium, for all intents and purposes, for theorizing, gets replaced in the 1940s, where equilibrium now becomes a solution point. We actually won't get into that too much because on the partial equilibrium, which is what, of course, we'll cover, it was always, in a sense, some kind of mechanical imagery, metaphor, which talks about equilibrium. So, but this was fairly prevalent at the time. If you want to read more about it, you read a book called The Invisible Hand, written by two Italians, whose names I'm not going to be able to pronounce, which talk about general equilibrium, but the issue of how equilibrium was articulated between 1870 and, say, 1930 was one way. Then you had the introduction of an alternative form of mathematics from these weirdo people in France into general equilibrium, or actually also in Austria as well, in which equilibrium now is defined as solution sense. Either you're there or you're not. There's no notion of going towards it in any particular way. So let us now look at our short period theory of prices. Now, Marshall's short period theory of prices is really short. And why is that? The reason why it's really short is because only undergraduates talk about the short period for Marshall. Real economists talk about the long period. which is of course the opposite of today. So you teach you guys short period stuff because you're really not capable of being real economists yet. So it's short and easy. The change from short period to long period as the focus of economic theorizing to short period occurs somewhere in the 1940s and 50s. Some would argue as a result of theoretical problems inherent within neoclassical theory. But that's something else, and anybody here is interested in capital controversies and things like that, come and see me and I'll talk to you about it. But Marshall did have his average total of expenses curve, and he has his marginal expenses, and of course the change in this particular point is normal output, and this is the price at this normal, price at this normal output. That's where Marshall starts from. Remember, we had an equation for the expenses, for the average expenses of production last week, where we listed all the material inputs and all this kind of stuff, divided by normal output. That's what he's working from. That's where this normal output does. He can able to come up with an average total expenses of production, and that's the basis of the market price. Now, at this point, then Marshall says, let's talk about variations from normal output. Yes?
Your subscript say.
NE, normal output at equilibrium price. Trying to notes, don't you have them in front of you? This is normal output here. Remember, this comes back from this notion of normal cost that we talked about last week. Now, this is in the short period, so in a sense, total output is given, for aggregate output is given for industry as a whole. So what he does is, let's talk about marginal variations. If there's a marginal increase in output, what happens to the market price? There's a marginal decline in output. What happens to the market price? That's the way he goes about it. He can't. Why does he have to do marginal? Because if you have to talk about really big ones, you've upset the entire framework in which you're working in. Remember, we're talking about stability in terms of industry output. So you can't talk about big changes because we're no longer saying that aggregate output for the industry is given. So we talk about it in terms of margin. Unfortunately, when we draw these things on the board, we make really big changes. It looks like there's big changes being made, but remember, they're all marginal. So he says, okay, what happens if we have a marginal increase in output for the industry? So it would imply a marginal increase in output for the representative firm. Well, his argument is as follows. The immediate effect of the expectation of a higher demand, whoops, that's not where I want to start. Okay. The immediate effect of the expectation of a higher demand price, which is caused by a marginal increase in demand, is to cause people to bring into active work all their appliances of production and to work them full time and perhaps overtime. The supply price is then the money cost of production, the expenses of production, money cost of production, as opposed to real cost of production. Of that part of the producers forces the undertaker, the entrepreneur. Everybody realize undertaker, British equivalent to entrepreneur, which is a damn French term. Of course, the British don't like these Frenchies out there. Certainly not at this time. It's amazing they could actually work together during the First World War.
If only he knew what undertaker meant in American English.
Yeah, but actually, well, no, let me take that back. I can't remember what thing they use in the UK. To hire such inefficient labor, perhaps tired by working overtimes, at so high a price, and to put himself and others to so much strain and inconvenience that he is on the margin of doubt whether it be worth its while, whether it is worth his while to do it or not. So, as you expand, as demand expands, the possibility of a higher price means that you bring on these inexperienced workers, older appliances, whatever, and hence, it would have to be that particular price to have the representative enterprise expand its production. They expand its production because the cost of increasing output has increased, that marginal cost. Now, what's the problem with this discussion? Taking it right out of Marshall, what's the problem? Well, how do you talk about having higher cost?
I think that's a cricket.
Has anybody heard of a thing called diminishing returns? Okay, I'm glad you hadn't heard of it because that excuses you for not knowing what's going on here. Diminishing returns, we've talked about it, right? And this is a fixed input, and you have apply a variable input to it and all this kind of stuff. And that's what increases the cost as you expand. Now, what do we have here? We have plant and equipment, so to speak, in place. If you're really talking about diminishing returns, you would have been applying more output to the existing appliances of production here. Now, the problem with this is that he doesn't say that.
More fixed inputs to the appliances, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
more variable input to the fixed input, that's what would do it. He says to bring in to active work all their appliances of production and to work them full time, which implies that normal output, they're not all being utilized. So it's not really a notion of diminishing returns. Of course, if anybody had any brains would say, well, you know, there's a real problem here. Let's ignore that kind of flowery language and just talk about diminishing returns. But that's not what Marshall says. So he actually discusses a basis for why you have why your marginal expense of production increases, but doesn't base it on diminishing returns. Clearly on. But he does it on the fact that he brings in basically appliances which are not being used. It could be old appliances, that is vintage technology, which is kept off to the side of normal output, so you only run about 80%. Then as you increase output, you bring on these old plants or whatever, old machines. Not, less skilled workers, except, you bring in women and they're less skilled workers, right? Remember, we're dealing with Marshall here. But that's an argument which you could sustain, but that's not a diminishing returns argument. So you have to be careful about what he says. But that's what he says. So basically, in order to produce more, the price has to be higher because you bring in all this less efficient stuff. You have to do all this extra work as an entrepreneur, and it's really a big bother. So you're going to have to really be paid more for your work because otherwise you wouldn't do it. And if you were Bill Gates, it'd be a couple of $1 billion to make him do something addition, things like that, or the president of Wells Fargo or whatever. Yes.
Isn't it expected that demand will be increased in some future date, and that's why?
That's long period.
Oh,
This is just short period.
because then you have uncertainty there.
But that's not, that, at this point, it's just these marginal changes. We have this kind of overall growth in demand. We'll come back to that particular story. So that's the first part. Now, what happens when demand is expected to fall below normal output? Well, this is what he says. If market demand is below normal output, entrepreneurs or undertakers generally hold out for a higher price. Each man fears to spoil his chance of getting a better price later on from his own customers, or if he produces for a large and open market, he is more or less in fear of incurring the resentment of other producers should he sell needlessly at a price that spoils the common market for all. Okay, what did he just say there?
He doesn't want to, you mean, he wants to gouge his customers, that's
No.
a.
If firms won't drop their price,
Okay.
Oh,
At least not very
collusion.
much.
so I mean, it's kind of similar, at least based on what I'm hearing, kind of similar to when you've got the peak demand curve in.
Ignore that. Okay, but that's right. It has an implication for it. We're talking about this damn diagram. That's why I have it on the board. But you're right. I mean, you're right. There's an implication there. What does it mean about this diagram?
There's a price floor?
Well, with what Drew mentioned implies. So what do you mean? So what does it mean about this diagram?
Whenever we go, price goes up.
What?
No matter which direction we go, price goes up.
No. This is probably you've been so indoctrinated in conventional ways of looking at it that you actually can't hear or see or do what has actually been said. He says, as demand falls, prices do not fall as much. There's a floor put on to prevent problems with your competitors and things like that. So instead of going down the marginal expense of production curve or your marginal cost curve, which is what everybody thinks is going to happen, he says, no, you go off the curve. That's precisely what you said, Drew. That's what you said. You said there was some kind of floor. And when you said a price floor, that's more or less what you said. So as demand declines, you don't go down your marginal expenses of production curve, you go off the curve. Okay. Now, consequently, the representative firm's supply price is a socially determined market price that is slightly below its normal supply price. Right? Has a floor slightly below it, but doesn't follow it all the way down the marginal expense of production curve. Hence, the fall in supply is due to the firm cutting production while maintaining the price into the marginal firm's ceasing production when the market price fell slightly, as Marshall would say. The reason I do this because this is what Marshall does. You've been introduced to a non-Marshall world, and the question is, what world did you come from, so to speak? The marginal production in this case is production of those whom a little further fall of price would cause either from a regard to their own interest or by formal or informal agreement with other producers, which is also immediately implies that we're not in a freely competitive world because now we have agreements with other producers. Seems to have missed the point here. Contradictions abound within Marshall. To suspend production for the fear of further spoiling the market. This is a well-known phrase in which people talked about the usefulness of Marshall in the context of conventional price theory. Marshall talked about spoiling the market. Of course, the issue here is that we're not now talking about a competitive market anymore, even under Marshall's own terms. But the term is still pregnant with meaning. It's just that he seems to be marching outside the world of neoclassical, of even budding neoclassical theory we see at this time. The price which For these reasons, producers are just on the point of refusing. It's a true marginal supply price for short periods. This is the true marginal supply price, not this one. So our marginal expense of production curve is not a supply curve, at least below normal output. It is nearly always above and generally very much above the special or prime cost. Marginal expense of production was also called prime cost. Well, no, I'm sorry. Now, in this framework, marginal expense of production would have been a notion of prime cost. Prime cost would be your direct cost, materials and labor, not your overhead cost. Can't help it, this is a different variation in terminology, meaning more or less the same thing at the time. It comes out of accounting literature, and for all of you who've never been exposed to this, it just looks confusing. Sorry, this is the world that we live in, or that was in existence at this time. It is always above and generally very much above the special or prime costs for raw materials, labor, and wear and tear of the plant, which is immediately and directly involved by getting a little further use out of the plants which are not fully employed. That's what if you increase demand. So under Marshall, we have an asymmetrical relationship between the representative firm's supply price and its marginal expenses of production, or marginal prime cost, in demand. So the supply curve, or what Marshall called basically the representative firm's short period supply curve, is B, A, C. Okay. That's the short period. The long period, even much more exciting. How exciting can it be? Well, let's just say in the long period, if you think that this was a little bit confusing and contradictory, in the long period, it's completely confusing and contradictory. It has things such as irreversible supply curves in it, which makes them a real nonsense of a long period. It has a requirement that supply curves must turn upward, because they slope downward and they have to turn upward. Why do they have to turn upward? Because if they don't, then we don't have a stable equilibrium. No more on that. But lots of fun. But I know you guys want to go home. There's something about a snowfall that's going to show up on Thursday, and you want to get home before Thursday so you don't get caught in it. So we'll start with Marshall's long period prices on next Tuesday, all right?
Woo!